Hey everyone, I want to introduce this archive video clip from November 1991. I think you'll find it pretty interesting. You also get to see a James Tabor in a younger period of his life, about 32 or 3 years ago. But the clip is very interesting. The setting is the release of the unpublished Dead Sea Scrolls. So let me explain that. When I first went to graduate school at the University of Chicago in the 1970s, I've still got it here after all these years. This is the actual book that I use, Gaze of Vermesh, the Dead Sea Scrolls in English. What I want you to notice is the size. It's about 230 pages, but 50 pages are an introduction to the scrolls and the actual texts of the scrolls when you begin reading the English translation would then be the rest of the pages. So, less than 200 pages. That's all we had. You can actually do a lot with these initial scrolls that were out. And by the time I started teaching in the 1980s, my first job was the University of Notre Dame after I'd gotten my PhD degree. This is the subsequent edition. Let's see, this is the third edition, and I think this was the first or second. So you can see it's thicker. I think it's up to 300 pages. So there's another 50 pages or so of scrolls that have been added. The introduction is still taking up 50 or so pages of the book, but this is it. And I taught out of this for years, way up until the 90s, the Dead Sea Scrolls in English. So there had been additional texts slowly released, but even at this time when this book came out, over 40% of the scrolls were still not out. Now, the fundamental scrolls that had been out since the 50s, I also was able to study in graduate school in this edition, which was German, but it had the Hebrew as well as a German translation you can see side by side. And this is a pretty good representation of the Hebrew text. And it also has vowel points put into it. So if you studied any Hebrew, you know that can be very critical in terms of reading this text. And I use this in my graduate courses. So this is basically what we had until the 1990s. And then in the 1990s, Robert Eisenman, Long Beach State University, was able to obtain the photographs of all the unpublished scrolls through Herschel Shanks and Bar Magazine, and he got James Robinson of Claremont also to go in with him on this. They published the 2 volumes of photographs of the unpublished scrolls, so it was a huge event in 1991. And in the clip you'll see in the video that's to follow in just a minute or two here, I show those volumes. They're very exciting to have. And so scholars are looking through the photographs, trying to read them, see what's there, because 40% of these scrolls had not been published. They tend to be pretty fragmented, but there's some very interesting fragments. So in this interview, I talk about 3 fragments. Now remember, we just gotten this material. One of them is 4Q285. It drew a lot of attention with the media when it was released because it seems to talk about the branch of David, the Messiah stemming from the line of David, being slain with woundings and piercings. So it was very controversial. And Geza Vermesh, the editor of the Dead Sea Scroll books in English that I was using, he wrote an article arguing that it didn't say that at all, that it actually was about the Messiah slaying a wicked one with woundings and piercings. And he made a good case for that. However, I responded to him in that same issue of Bar Magazine. And you can get both of those on my blog. If you go to my blog, jamestabor.com, I put those articles up where you can read them. They are under the academic drop-down where it has my different published articles and papers. They're PDFs that you can read if you're interested in reading those today. So I argued that the verdict was still out and we shouldn't be so hasty to dismiss this idea. And that's kind of where it got left. By far, most scholars today would say that it's not about a slain Messiah, but a slaying Messiah, a Messiah that kills his enemies, which does fit the text of Isaiah 11 much better, I think. But here's the thing. In 2000, Michael Weiss published a trade book, popular book, called The First Messiah, in which he argued, not on the basis of this text, but a rereading of the Thanksgiving hymns, some of which were written by the teacher of the Dead Sea Scroll community, the teacher of righteousness. And the Messiah before Jesus, he's arguing that this Messiah, or this messianic figure, the teacher, who's a prophet like Moses, according to his followers, that he also identified with the suffering idea of a suffering servant, even from Isaiah 53. So that was major. And then the same year, Israel Knoll, Hebrew University professor, Israeli scholar, wrote a book called The Messiah Before Jesus, and he made a similar but independent argument for the same. And these authors did not know each other was writing books with these arguments. So I'd say the question is vastly expanded now. Whether this fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls is talking about a slain Messiah or not, it was a good discussion to open up at the time. The second text I discuss in this clip is 4Q521. It's usually called the Messianic Apocalypse. And it begins with this famous line, the heavens and the earth will obey his Messiah. And then it talks about what he'll do. He'll make the blind see, heal the sick, make the lame walk, preach good news to the poor. But in the Dead Sea Scroll text, it says, and he will make live the dead, he'll raise the dead. And it's building off of Psalm 145, but particularly Isaiah 61, which talks about this messianic figure. And I explain all this in the interview, so I won't go over it again. But in Luke, in what we call the two-source material of Luke, sometimes called Q, John the Baptist asked Jesus, are you the one or should we look for another? He sends messengers to Jesus. And when Jesus tells him the signs of the Messiah, he alludes to a tradition that is reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls because he mentions the dead will be raised. And Isaiah 61 does not have that. It has preach good news to the poor, but not and raise the dead. So it looks like a pretty good shared tradition that of a messianic expectation that when the Messiah comes, he would raise the dead. And finally, I talk about in the video the translation of Isaiah 53, what it would be like in an English version if you went by the Dead Sea Scroll. Just this week, I put up a video about my translation of the Hebrew Bible, in which I've put out some selected excerpts and samples of the translation. And I did include Isaiah 53. And the thing about Isaiah 53, that's the suffering servant song, one of the four suffering servant songs. It starts in 52:11, goes through 53:10. And Christians, of course, early on identified Jesus as that suffering servant. And I argue in my Mark course that even though Jesus applied that to the Son of Man, he intended that to be a group of suffering servants that would follow him. And that's why after he says what he says about it, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. He says, and if anyone would follow me, take up a cross and follow me. So Even though it was applied to Jesus by the early Christians, I think there was also this collective idea, at least in the Gospel of Mark, and probably in Paul as well, because he talks about filling up the sufferings of Jesus in his own life. So Christians use this, but in the Dead Sea Scroll version of Isaiah, it's very interesting. A couple of the verses read very differently from the Masoretic text. And verse 11 in particular talks about from the travail of his soul, this person who's going to be killed and buried, he will see light, and possibly then an allusion to the light falling upon Sheol, the world of the dead, and him somehow being raised, because it goes on to say he will triumph over his enemies and see his offspring prosper and so forth. So I hope you enjoy this clip, a little journey to the past, and this was the excitement of those days as we began to uncover the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let me mention finally, I am in the process of preparing a course, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it'll come out with myth vision courses that Derek Lambert produces from Myth Vision Podcast. And I hope we can have it out by August, end of the summer here. And it will go into all of these things and many more in terms of the whole story of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we will use the English translations of Vermish to get at, for those who don't know Hebrew, some of the meanings of the Dead Sea Scrolls and our understanding of them now after 30 years. So here's the clip.
And so, from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte is Professor James Tabor. And thank you very much for joining us.
It's good to be with you today.
It's great to have a principal exponent of a new idea with you, because you can get it straight from the beginning. Now, you have three texts about Messiah that we can discuss.
Right.
And the first one is what we call the slain Messiah text.
Yeah, that's the one that caused all the stir last month.
This was in the newspaper.
That's right.
Can you enlighten us then?
Yeah, before I do the three, I'm going to also show you something officially. This is brand new. It's only been out about a week. In fact, I had it sent overnight UPS to have it for this show. This is, I guess you could say, the bootleg edition of the Unpublished Scrolls.
Right. This is the one that made out of the...
Dr. Robert Eisenman and James Robinson at Claremont. Eisenman is at Long Beach State. They obtained the photographs.
Wait, and these little fragments, somebody had to stitch all that together?
It's 1,657 fragments, similar to the ones we're going to talk about. Who knows what's in them all. Never been seen before. In fact, I'm sure this book has never been seen before on television until now. Some of them will be impossible to decipher, very small. Others you can read if you know Hebrew just quite easily. So there's this is only in Hebrew, so it is available, but unless you know Hebrew, there might not be a lot of point in getting it. But the point is, all the unpublished material is now out and available to any scholar who wants
Somebody who can read that can now see for himself.
In fact, the first two scrolls I'm going to show you, let's start with this first one, which we call the Slain Messiah text that made the newspapers that you did the story on November the 8th. It's a small fragment right here in the center of the page. It has other parts to it, but this is the fragment we're interested in, and I've got a blow-up, actually, of that middle fragment right here. And I think with a little bit of work we can read it together, and I actually want to go over it word for word because every word is quite interesting. It starts out, you can probably make that out.
Yeshayahu.
Yeah, Isaiah, the prophet, Hanavi. And now this word we're not sure of, but then it begins to quote Isaiah 11:1, which is a text about the Messiah. It says, there's the verb yatzah, there will come forth a staff, or
branch,
not a branch, but a stem from the Geza, from the root of Jesse. There's Jesse there. And then it goes on to say, this is kind of the striking phrase, Tzemach, the branch of David. So it goes from Isaiah 11 to probably maybe Jeremiah or Zechariah. Remember, there are references to the Messiah
The branch.
also being called the branch. So the branch of David. So very strongly branded as a messianic text, quoting probably definitely Isaiah, probably Jeremiah, maybe Zechariah. And then it says something, it's difficult to say for sure, but something like they will be judged. So perhaps that the branch of David will judge the world, or maybe that they will judge him. By the way, I'm reflecting the help of Professor Michael Weiss, who discovered this text in the photographs and his translation and the variables that I'm giving you here. Then very clearly it talks, you can see the word, there's a mem and a vav and a tet in Hebrew, which is the verb for to die. So this was the key verse that really kind of shocked people. It says, they will put him to death, or he will be put to death, the prince of the congregation, the Nasi, the prince of the congregation. Remember, the Messiah is also called the prince in Daniel. So it probably means the prince of the congregation will be put to death. They will put him to death.
Messiah, the prince, Daniel 9.
Exactly. Now notice that. That's a tzadi and a mem, but the other word is dropped out. But look, we have that right here. Say mock again. Others, that is the branch. So they will put to death the prince of the congregation, the branch. I think one letter gone, but probably that's what it says. Then with woundings or piercings, see that? You can see halal there. With woundings or piercings, and then you go to this word, the priest will command, or the priest will command woundings and piercings. Seems to say then that they will put this nasi, or this tzemak, this branch, to death. So that's what all the stir was about. Suddenly we had a text from Qumran that clearly talks about the Messiah being suffering or being slain. That seems to be a valid interpretation. The verdict is somewhat out because we want to work on these other fragments. Maybe there are other materials that go with this, but that seems pretty clear, as you could see even from the Hebrew there. We can't say who it refers to because it doesn't give a name. I see two possibilities. One would be that they have put text together, that they've taken a text like Isaiah 53 about the suffering of a servant of God, as well as a text like Isaiah 11 about the branch of David or the king, put them together. I think that's unlikely, though, because even in the New Testament, in the Gospels, you have the disciples presented as not putting that together. They react to the event. Then they say, well, we know he was the Messiah, but he was slain. Oh, yeah, it must mean this and this. And they went back and found those texts, you know, these suffering texts. I think it's much more likely that the latter happened, that what we very well might have here, I'm not positive, but we might have a text written in actual reaction to the wounding or piercing or slaying of a figure that this group had great hope in. But to say it's Jesus, of course, that's going beyond the evidence. Although we can now say, if this translation holds, that this group also was thinking in terms of the suffering Messiahs. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, Judaism teaches that. There's the Mashiach ben Yosef, the suffering servant. But you see, that's late. That's late in the Talmud and in other midrashic materials. This is an early text. You cannot show, I don't know of a Hebrew text in the Midrash, the Talmud, the Mishnah, you know, these ancient Jewish sources, this early, that talks about Messiah being pierced or slain. So this, other than the New Testament, this is it. But what it means is that other Jewish groups of the time were also in some way discussing something like this. Now, this text was published in Bar Magazine, Biblical Archaeology Review, about the last issue, the current issue, actually. But before that, I had not seen it. It's in the Unpublished Scrolls, so no one else has seen it. I'm sure it's never been on television before. And it's got some interesting lines. There are 13 lines. We won't do them all, but I did want you to notice, because you do read Hebrew here, this is very clear. This is the end of the word. The heavens and the earth will obey. See Shema there. Just like the Shema, or Shema, and then Mashiach, his Messiah.
His Messiah.
So it starts out in this column talking about a time, a messianic era. So what this text has to do with is a description of what will happen when the Messiah comes. It just gives a description of their expectations, essentially. And some of them are commonplace. I've got a translation here I'll read. For example, it says that the Lord will visit the pious, and the righteous he will call by name. Over the poor will his spirit hover, and the faithful he will support with strength. But as you get down to about line 8, which is right here, I think you'll recognize some of this language. He will release the prisoners, make the blind see, and raise up those bent in the dust. Now, I'm going to put this down a minute and come back, but you've got an English Bible there. If you read, I'll just let you turn to it. Read Luke chapter 4.
Okay, Luke 4:18.
Yeah.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord.
Okay. Now, if you look at some of the phrases we just read about release the prisoners, make the blind see, and raise up those bent in the dust, that is an allusion to the Psalms. In fact, it's Psalm 146, but also to, in Luke 4, this is where Jesus gets up in the synagogue and reads Isaiah 61. And the key phrase is the one you just read. Now, here's what this text says. Let's compare it. It says, he will heal, here you have Rapha, he will heal the wounded, and he will make the dead live, the verb chaya, to live, like l'chaim, you know, in Jewish parlance. So he'll make the dead live, and to the poor he will preach the gospel. So what you have here is quite striking. You've got a partial quotation of Isaiah 61, which you're reading here.
But it didn't say make the dead live.
That's it. That's what I noticed immediately, that if you read Isaiah 61, the key phrase is that he will make the blind see, release the prisoners, and to the poor announce the good tidings, you know, the gospel.
Yes.
But if you turn over to Luke 7, just a couple pages over there, and this is a passage that we believe, in scholarly parlance, we call this the Q source. This is a very early source that Luke himself used. He says that remember in his preface, he says that he has looked at different sources and so forth. We believe that this is an early source he used, and I think it's around, you see verse
I see verse 22, tell him to go. Yeah, he asks, are you he that was to come,
right.
or do we look for another?
What it is John the Baptist, who's usually identified with this community in some fashion, he's out in the wilderness, same place, baptizing.
Yeah.
You know, if you've been to Qumran, you know you can look and see the river, the Dead Sea and the Jordan River area. He's asking Jesus, are you the Messiah, or should we look for another? Now read, what is it, verse 22, where we have Jesus reply.
Yeah, then Jesus answering said unto them, go your way, and tell John what things ye have seen and heard, how that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised. To the poor the gospel is preached.
Okay. Notice the last two phrases. The dead are raised, to the poor the gospel is preached. Now, it's partly then from Isaiah 61, but as you immediately notice, Isaiah 61 does not say that the Messiah, when he comes, will raise the dead. It mentions many of these other things. Yeah. And yet Luke's record of what Jesus told John the Baptist includes this phrase. Now, here's how I would see the significance of this. I think that Jesus is answering John in what I would call coded language. That is, they know what they're talking about. Signs of the Messiah. Built on these scriptures, such as Isaiah, the Psalms, but with this added phrase, raise the dead, as kind of the real key, you see. And
he's saying to them, you tell John this, listen carefully. And he quotes from a commentary written at Qumran that John would
maybe John would know, and maybe Jesus himself knew. That in other words, the groups are sharing this common belief, and it's not just a general belief, it's a very specific belief. Tick it off. He will do this, he will do this, including raise the dead.
I identify myself as Messiah to you, John, by this code.
By the well-known criteria that we now can see. And so I'm not saying Luke is quoting this or this is quoting Luke. I'm saying they're both quoting a well-known and well-understood, very patterned language, you see. Yeah. And I think this is the first absolutely tight linguistic connection of the New Testament. There are lots of phrases like New Covenant and so forth, but this is tighter than that. This is literally down to who's the Messiah, what will he do? We read Luke, here's an answer. We read this text, here's an answer. I think it's fascinating.
Dr. Tabor, this is quite a discovery.
Yeah. Another thing is we do not have clear references to the Qumran community believing in resurrection of the dead. In fact, that's debated among the scholars. Did they or did they not have that as part of what we call their eschatology, their view of the end? And as you know, in the New Testament, resurrection of the dead is the key doctrine. Paul makes it a big point in the book of Acts. You know, I believe in the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15, you know, is very strong on that. This is one of our strongest indications that they do believe. There are allusions elsewhere, but this is absolutely clear in Hebrew. There's no doubting the reading. He will make live, literally, the dead ones.
Yeah, that's very clear.
So I think it's quite a fascinating text.
Very nice. Now, the Isaiah 53:11 text, which is about Messiah and the light.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Now, we're going here from Unpublished, which is now published. I say unpublished meaning till last week.
Yes.
The two we just looked at, they're published now because Barr has put them out. But this Isaiah scroll, Isaiah 53, of course, has been known for centuries. It's in everybody's Bible.
This is he
Christians
goes
and
as
Jews.
a lamb to the slaughter. By
That's
his
right,
stripes
that's
are
right.
healed.
The servant. And it's variously interpreted. Is it Messiah? Is it the people of Israel? Is it a righteous servant, a tzaddik, you know, of Israel? But anyway, this is Isaiah 53, beautiful text in Hebrew, of, as you know, in Cave 1, first discoveries made by the Bedouin shepherd boy. This whole scroll was found, complete scroll of Isaiah.
Yeah.
And you've seen it, I think, have you not?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, because you did that
I was
program.
in the museum there. Yeah.
And I think you demonstrated that a modern Israeli can simply sight read this. It's that clear. It's
Sure,
absolutely
it's
clear.
very easy to read.
Now, so this is not an unpublished text, but it's an interesting text. Now, people often ask, when you compare the Isaiah of Qumran, which is 2,000 years old or more, and the Isaiah text that we have today, copies of copies of copies, medieval Hebrew manuscripts, are there major differences? The answer is no. But there are some significant differences, and one of them I wanted to talk to you about is in verse 11 here. You have English Isaiah 53, verse 11. This would be the common King James translation of Isaiah 53:11. Go ahead and read
He
it.
shall see of the travail of his soul and shall be satisfied.
Okay. We'll just take that phrase. If you notice in Hebrew here, this is literally from the travail, there's nephesh, of his soul. He will see.
Okay.
Now, the word I've circled here is the direct object. He will see what? Light.
Or
That's not in your text you just read. Now, if you don't have the word light, you would have to translate it from the travail of his... read it again. I'm getting mixed up.
yeah, it's
what they did with that.
He shall see of the travail of his soul.
Yeah, which in a way doesn't make sense. So he will see from the travail of his soul. Well, what will he see, you see? So in the Qumran scroll, you have the word light. He will see light. Now, I think this is an allusion to resurrection for this reason. Isaiah in chapter 27 and in other places uses light as a metaphor for raising the dead. The dead are in Sheol and darkness, and they see light. And this is talking about a man suffering, being buried, and then seeing light, you see. So the point would be that this word light was in copies of Isaiah from the first century, during the time of Jesus, during the time of Paul, during the time of the early rabbis. Apparently was in their copies. And now here's a modern Hebrew Bible upon which the King James was based, Masoretic text, standard text, in which the word light is missing. Here's a first century text. It does have it. I think that Paul, in his letter to Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15, he says that the Christ, the Messiah, died, was buried, and was raised. And then he adds this phrase after each one, according to the Scriptures, which means the Hebrew Bible.
He read it so.
Now, where does it say in the Hebrew Bible that the Messiah will be raised from the dead? I can't think of a place, clearly. Not like this.
No, not
So
as
it
clear
could
as
be that he's referring to this text. I am persuaded that he is, because this text talks about burial, death, clearly, burial, and now with this reading, it also talks about somebody seeing light. Now, all I'm saying is I think that was Paul's interpretation. And by the way, the New International Version, which many people go in a bookstore, look, has put it back in.
Put it back in.
And the
Wow,
new
that-
RSV that just came out last year, no, it just came out this year, has put it back in. So the two latest modern scholarly versions have included this reading. So
How do they sit with Jewish scholars that...
they're well respected. In fact, Jews were on the committee of the new RSV. I think scholarly Jews are interested in text, they're not interested in debating theology. So if the text has it, and this seems to be the oldest reading, why not put it back in?
This is what
we can still debate what it means, but it's in. I think basically it's in. And I wouldn't, in fact, the newer Jewish versions will eventually footnote it, I think, as time goes on. We're in an era now of open discussion. These are Jewish texts I'm showing you. These aren't Christian texts.
No,
all three of
not,
these are thoroughly Jewish texts.
Yeah.
And yet they're talking about things that Jews and Christians have in common and need to